All right, very good evening, everyone, and welcome to the continuation of the DFW Society of the Archaeological Institute of America Spring 2021 lecture. I'm Martin Gallagher, and I'm the president of the local society, and I also teach Latin, classical mythology, and classical archaeology here at UNT. Uh, the talk tonight by Dr. Nikolaus Overtoom of Washington State on ancient Parthia is doing double duty as well, thanks to the generous support of the Department of World Literatures, Languages, and Cultures here at UNT. And I want to extend a special thanks on behalf of the DFW Society and all of you to Professor Marin Kaplan, the chair of the department, as well as Green Graff, the chair of the committee. So as you all heard, this meeting is being recorded and live streamed on our YouTube channel. However, participants should refrain from using any of their own video or image capture, and that allows us to safeguard the intellectual property of our presenter. And so we ask that you respect that. Thanks very much for your cooperation. The Archaeological Institute of America is North America's oldest and largest professional organization dedicated to the study of archaeology. Founded in 1879 and chartered by an act of Congress in 1906, we continue to advance the study of archaeology in the public interest. And we're unique as a professional organization is that it's a vital part of our mission to engage people at all levels, not only professional archaeologists, educators like ourselves, but students and interested lay people. So we support all those groups, as well as excavations, publications, research, and site preservations. And our programs and publications, like tonight's lecture, are all aimed at keeping you up to date with archaeological discoveries and research from around the world. And you can read all about it in our engaging publications, which again run the gamut of people interested in archaeology. We have our very popular archaeology magazine with a readership of over 700,000, including in-depth stories and updates, which are written in an accessible way, but by professional archaeologists. And if you want more, you're a professional. The American Journal of Archaeology is the world's leading journal, particularly in the field of Mediterranean archaeology. But archaeology is not meant to only be done from an armchair, so we also want to invite you to dig in and experience archaeology with the AIA, attend a lecture like this one, an archaeology fair or other local events. Or if you're a student, find an excavation on our extensive list of fieldwork opportunities. And if you're a layperson, especially, visit spectacular archaeological sites around the world with our tours program. And indulge your passion for archaeology and join us. And if it's not obvious that you're in the DFW area, be sure to indicate in your membership that you want to support the DFW Society and help uncover the past, and perhaps experience the thrill of discovery yourself, and also enjoy exclusive member benefits. If you want to go further and support the work of the AIA to make archaeology possible, we are a nonprofit and rely on the generosity of donors like you to support our mission. This makes possible archaeological research, site preservations, publications, and programs like tonight's lecture possible. So the local society of the AIA is led by myself and a number of people representing all of those constituencies, including students and interested lay people in the area. Please contact us with any comments or questions or suggestions on info@dfwarchaeological.org. Before I introduce tonight's speaker, I'd just like to remind you of a couple of upcoming lectures. First of all, our executive committee member, Elizabeth Molachek, on Friday morning is giving a museum seminar on the early acquisition of classical art in U.S. museums. And so I'm very much looking forward to that. Go on the Edith O'Connell program in art history at the University of Texas at Dallas to register for that. Our next lecture will be by Professor Andrea Berlin of Boston University, speaking about the Kyrenia shipwreck. I know many of you are interested in shipwrecks, a burgeoning area of our field. And we're very excited to welcome Andrea Berlin after just before COVID, her flight was not allowed to land at DFW Airport. So we're glad to have her back as well. We are also going to have a short reception. As in the old days, we would all be inviting you to Mr. Chopsticks for a 2-hour dinner, but we can't quite do that. We do still want to give you an opportunity to chat less formally with the speaker. So there will be a short reception in my Zoom room. You can see the address there below. And I'll also mention that in the chat. So with that, I'd like to invite Dr. Overtoom to share his screen. Okay,
everyone
great.
See that?
So,
yeah, good.
I can. I hope everyone else can as well. It's my distinct privilege to welcome back to the University of North Texas our alumnus, Dr. Nikolaus Overtoom. He was one of the first students to earn the minor in classical studies at the University of North Texas, and also took the full course of Latin and French here. From there, he went on to graduate degrees at the University of Maryland and the Louisiana State University, culminating with his PhD in, I believe, classical and Middle Eastern studies, an excellent combination at LSU. He's now the clinical assistant professor of history at Washington State University. Sorry. Nick's talk tonight is stemming from his recent book, The Reign of Arrows, The Rise of the Parthian Empire in the Hellenistic Middle East, which has been published as part of the prestigious Oxford Studies in Early Empires series of Oxford University Press. And Nick also has several articles on Hellenistic and Roman history. And so, Nick, you're very welcome.
Thank you for that. I'd like to start off by saying that I know we have a very mixed bag as far as attendees. We have classicists, we have linguists, we have archaeologists, we have just general audience, and indeed some historians. So I've tried to put together something that kind of ticks all of those boxes and hopefully satisfies all of you at least a little bit, in sort of introducing my work on the Parthians and Parthian history in particular. My talk today is titled Understanding Parthian Success and Reconstructing Parthian History in the Hellenistic World, an Introduction to the Challenges of Parthian Scholarship and Sources. So again, another thing I want to do is I want to make sure that I thank you all for this, this opportunity. I want to thank Martin for that generous introduction. It's my pleasure to participate in the Dallas Archaeological Institute of America lecture series, which is hosted by the University of North Texas, through indeed the World Languages, Literatures, and Cultures Department for their Spring 2021 Spring Series. I'd like to thank specifically Dr. Martin Gallagher and Dr. Christopher Furman for their invitation, their interest, and their hard work in indeed making this talk possible, especially during the COVID pandemic. I also would like to thank everyone here who's spending their Wednesday evening listening to research on the Parthians, their kings, a group of men known as the Arsacids, and indeed the larger ancient Middle East. So my book, as Martin touched on, is titled Reign of Arrows, The Rise of the Parthian Empire in the Hellenistic Middle East. It was published in May 2020 by Oxford University Press in the Oxford Studies in Early Empire series. And it investigates the rise of the Parthians, underrepresented and underappreciated Eastern people, from migrants on the Central Asian steppe to conquerors of the Hellenistic Middle East from roughly the 3rd to the 1st centuries BCE. The primary purpose of Reign of Arrows is to create more awareness and further the discussion of Parthia and of the Parthians on their own terms, as well as within the wider context of the ever-changing international environments of the post-Alexander the Great Hellenistic world. The ongoing pandemic has made the promotion of this book exceedingly difficult over the past several months, so I'm thrilled that it's not gone unnoticed and that I have the opportunity here tonight to share some of it with you. So unfortunately, and yet unsurprisingly, there are unavoidable textual and material limitations to our definitive understanding of early Parthian history and the history of the larger Hellenistic Middle East in this period. Our sources for Parthian history are few, they're scattered, and almost all from a Greek and Roman perspective. Therefore, my recent book is a new interpretation of the political and military history of the Hellenistic Middle East that offers a new assessment of the rise of the Parthian state to help encourage general interest in the subject and to help create a platform for further scholarly debate on the topic. Compared to scholarly attention paid to the other major pre-Islamic empires of the Middle East, the empires of the Achaemenid Persians, the Seleucid Macedonians, and the Sassanid Persians, the Arsacid Parthians received little appreciation. This led one scholar recently to describe the Parthian era as, quote, among the least known in Oriental history and archaeology, unquote. Meanwhile, in the context of world history, one historian recently noted, quote, it is this region, Parthia, and ruling power, the Arsacids, that has been missed in the coverage of world history as Rome and China have been the main focus for world historians, unquote. Thus, my research helps bring the Parthian Empire further out of the shadows of history and sheds new light on the Parthians' important contributions to the geopolitical and cultural developments of the Middle Eastern world. With the sometimes severe limitations of our available sources in mind, the potential insights that the theoretical framework of modern international relations theory offers to the study of Parthian political history is quite exciting. The pioneering work by Dr. Arthur Eckstein, Mediterranean Anarchy, Interstate War, and the Rise of Rome, published in 2006, emphasized the potential insights that the theoretical framework of modern IR theory can offer to the study of ancient geopolitics. Such an approach also offers exciting new avenues of inquiry for Parthian history. Eckstein utilized IR theory as a framework to challenge prevailing concepts as to why the Romans were so successful in subjugating the Mediterranean world, a methodological approach to which my research on Parthian imperialism owes a great debt. The application of IR theory helps provide a fuller appreciation of the geopolitical developments of the Parthian state and may help us overcome some of the limitations of our sources, which I will talk about in more detail a little bit later. However, it must be said that it is not a cure-all, and it must be utilized carefully within the parameters of our surviving literary and physical evidence. Therefore, recent work in archaeology and numismatics, that is the study of coinage, is invaluable to the historical reconstruction of Parthian history. And my research is in line with other recent efforts to reevaluate the growth of the Parthian state through the investigation of new evidence such as cuneiform records, archaeological remains, and numismatics. There have been relatively few comprehensive studies of the formation, growth, and international relations of the Parthian state. Most studies of this sort are either outdated, cursory, or in the case of numerous recent attempts, written for popular consumption and therefore of limited or questionable academic merit. Furthermore, interest in much later Roman and Parthian interactions dominates this field. Although there is growing interest in Parthian studies, Reign of Arrows is the first comprehensive monograph dedicated entirely to the early Parthian history period prior to contact with Rome. Archaeological research on the Parthian era, in fact, only began to elicit comprehensive attention in the past half century, severely handicapping Parthian studies prior to the 1970s. One of the first archaeologists to examine the archaeological traces of the Parthians, a man named Edward Kayal, originally described the Parthians in the 1960s and the 1970s as quote unquote lesser mortals. And he said that they were lesser mortals when compared to the other imperial dynasts of the Middle East. And he in fact referred to the Arsacids, that is the rulers of the Parthians, as the quote, political clowns of the millennium, unquote. Fortunately, Parthian studies has been a growing field, particularly since the 1990s, and scholars continue to work diligently to discredit such unfounded and negative portrayals of the Parthians. Yet until recently, scholars still generally considered Nielsen de Beauvoir's 1938 study of the Parthians to be the best available summary of early Parthian political history, despite the acknowledgement from many historians that his history begged for revision. Thankfully, my book has, in theory, corrected this problem. So scholarship on early Parthian history often suffers from what IR theorists call unit attribute theory, which is the belief that internal forces of a single state determine external outcomes. Unfortunately, such an approach generally overlooks possible external explanations for larger international developments and the larger international environment. Although the internal characteristics of states and statesmen remain important, since the answers to state or unit success ultimately lie within them, on their own, they lack scope. States exist within competitive interstate systems, and by overlooking a system-level analysis of geopolitical developments, scholars ignore half the picture. A good example of misguided unit attribute theory in Parthian studies is the notion that Parthian success stemmed from a nationalistic Iranian backlash against the Hellenistic Macedonian Seleucids. The formation of the Parthian state traditionally has been described as a barbarian nationalistic slave uprising against Greek masters in an attempt to reclaim Asia for the Asians. Likewise, the Parthians' war against the Seleucids has been described as a nationalistic crusade against Hellenism. And more recently, Iranian scholars have argued that an ethnic nationalism emerged under the Parthians as a reaction to Hellenism. Yet the success of the Parthians was not the result of an Eastern rejection and reaction against Hellenism. In fact, the early Parthian rulers often were Philhellenes, or friends of the Greeks, and many incorporated this designation into their coinage and titulature. Thus, the nationalism theory to explain Parthian success is inaccurate and inappropriate. Another good example of unit attribute theory in Parthian studies is the argument that Parthian success stemmed from the eager restoration of the image of the Achaemenid Persian Empire. Although the Parthians came to embrace much of Persian culture as they occupied the Middle East, they also adopted Hellenistic cultural aspects and maintained a unique identity of their own. Thus, the restoration theory is dismissive and inadequate. Furthermore, there are other problematic unit attribute explanations worth considering. There's a misguided tradition that describes the Parthians as feeble or passive, blaming the incompetence or weakness of Parthia's enemies, especially the Seleucids, to explain Parthian successes. Yet this parasitic theory unjustifiably robs the Parthians of their agency and accomplishment. Additionally, another argument claims that a desire to control the lucrative trade routes between the Eastern and Western worlds was a primary motivation for Parthian expansion. However, the sources do not support this conclusion. Greater economic prosperity was a welcome, although arguably inadvertent, result of Parthian expansion. And the sources clearly demonstrate that the political security of the state and the military reputation of the early Arsacid kings principally motivated expansion. Thus, the economic theory misses the mark. Finally, other scholars argue that the Parthians' expansionism and aggression towards neighbors was endemic and stemmed from their cavalry-based army and their need to find more land for their cavalry-based aristocracy. Yet this makes Parthian belligerence appear unique and mostly ignores the considerable outside dangers that the Parthians faced from highly militarized and aggressive neighbors. Thus, the land hunger theory is short-sighted. None of these theories considers Parthian motivations and success within the larger context of the international system of states in the ancient world. Ultimately, the great benefit of applying IR theory to an evaluation of geopolitical developments in the ancient world is that it allows us to gain greater perspective and avoid myopic conclusions through the investigation of systemic pressures within interstate systems, which of course affected all state decision-making. Thus, my research finds that the crucial factors which most accurately help explain the eventual triumph of the Parthians are the versatility of Parthian society, the innovations of the Parthian military, and the early Arsacid kings' ability to manage and exploit these qualities to the benefit of the state through their capable leadership and dynastic stability. Excuse me. So my research covers a wide range of peoples, places, and events, and therefore it utilizes a considerable array of surviving literary sources on Hellenistic and Parthian history. However, archaeological, epigraphic, and numismatic materials also are of importance because so little of the historical record of the Parthians has survived. In reconstructing Parthian history, we must maneuver through Greek and Roman literary sources that dominate the narrative and often treat the Parthians hostilely or cursorily, and mostly from a negative foreign perspective. Meanwhile, Armenian, Arab, and Chinese literary sources often offer some surviving evidence of Parthian history and culture. However, these sources also often suffer from the aforementioned limitations. Scholars must supplement the historical record of the Parthians with material evidence to help recreate acceptable and plausible reconstructions of Parthian history. Therefore, it is appropriate to discuss briefly the usefulness and restrictiveness of our literary, archaeological, epigraphic, and numismatic evidence on the rise of the Parthian state. Unfortunately, no account of Parthia's history survives from their perspective. The late Roman epitomizer Justin notes that the Augustan age writer Pompeius Trogus stressed the reserved and taciturn nature of the Parthians, recording that they were, quote, readier to act than speak, and consequently shrouded both their successes and failures in silence, unquote. Justin's account of Trogus's work, which attempted in part to record a history of the Parthians up to the reign of Augustus, indicates that Trogus appeared frustrated by this silence of the Parthians. The Parthians tended to rely on oral traditions for legends and stories, and therefore many of these legends and stories were lost or drastically altered before they were written down. It is quite possible that the Parthians had not created a thorough or readily available historical record of their rise to power within the Hellenistic Middle East by at least the Augustan age, leaving Trogus to rely on a collection of Greek authors and Roman observations. Moreover, the succeeding Sassanid Persians viewed the Arsacid Parthians as unworthy interlopers, and the Muslims viewed the Parthians as contemptible infidels. And therefore, whatever Parthian documents survived in the East into the 3rd century CE were either ignored or suppressed in the following centuries. Thus, to attempt to understand the Parthians, one must engage the Greco-Roman literary tradition. However, scholars also rely heavily on 3 major alternative sources of information, namely archaeological records, the Babylonian astronomical diaries, and Parthian coinage. Material evidence in the form of inscriptions, ostraca, art, architecture, and urban planning helped scholars reconstruct cultural, political, and economic developments within the Parthian state to broaden our understanding of the intricacies and multiculturalism of Parthian society. Field surveys in Iraq, Iran, Afghanistan, and Pakistan continue to yield valuable evidence that enhances the historical record. Yet interest in the field is relatively new, and important sites are difficult to access because of the ongoing instability of the modern Middle East. Astronomical diaries are a collection of cuneiform tablets that record a long series of astronomical observation and important events and weather. These tablets offer a rare internal voice to the developments of the Parthian state. For my research, they provide invaluable evidence of Parthian rule in and around Mesopotamia from the 140s to the 90s BCE. However, their fractured existence, their small geographical focus, and their restricted detail limits their overall usefulness on their own. Finally, much Parthian coinage has survived, which helps scholars reconstruct the structure and the chronology of the Arsacid dynasty and Parthian history. Moreover, the quality, abundance, and features of these coins provide important insights into periods of internal strife and external conflict, helping scholars identify the objectives of Parthian imperial propaganda. Numismatics is, of course, an invaluable aspect of reconstructing the history of Parthia, but also Parthia's rivals in the Middle East, that is, Hellenistic Bactria and the Seleucid Empire. Much like the available archaeological records and the surviving astronomical diaries, the usefulness of Parthian coinage to the reconstruction of Parthian history on its own is limited. Yet, although the relative ambiguity of these Parthian sources makes definitive conclusions based upon them difficult, they are important supplements to our Greek and Roman literary evidence. The Greeks, and particularly the Romans, came to view the Parthians as major rivals and found the Parthians and their history of interest. Although it's fragmentary, Polybius, the great Greek writer from the Hellenistic period, provides our earliest surviving account of Parthian history. He briefly chronicles the eastern campaign of the Seleucid king Antiochus III, and this campaign was actually against the Parthians and the Bactrians from 211 to 205 BCE. And he does this using now lost Hellenistic sources. Apollodorus and Posidonius, whose works are mostly lost, and Diodorus Siculus and Isidore of Carax were other Greeks who were interested in the Parthians and chronicled aspects of early Parthian society and history. Parthian history eventually became a vibrant and popular literary genre during the Roman imperial period, especially at times of conflict between Rome and Parthia. And the Roman audience became familiar with their eastern foe in the form of Parthia. For instance, Cassius Dio, writing in the early 3rd century CE, states, quote, "Now that there, that is the Parthians race, and their country and their peculiar customs now have been written by many, I have no intention of describing them," which of course we wish he had taken the time to describe them. It is not a coincidence that Livy, Pompeius Trogus, Strabo, Nicholas of Damascus, Quintus Dellius, and Apollonius wrote their accounts of Parthian history after the catastrophic defeats of the Roman generals Crassus in 54-53 BCE and Mark Antony in 36-35 BCE, and during also Emperor Augustus's subsequent rivalry with the Parthians. Nor is it a coincidence that Plutarch, Tacitus, Appian, and Arrian wrote their accounts of the Parthians during and after Emperor Trajan's Parthian War, 114 to 117 CE. Nor that Lucian made mention of new works on the Parthians written after Emperor Varus's Parthian War, 161 to 166 CE. Nor that Cassius Dio, Asinius Quadratus, and perhaps Justin wrote their accounts on Parthian history after the wars of the Severan emperors against Parthia severely damaged the Parthian state, and those dates are 195, 197 to 198, and then also 216 to 217 CE. Nor finally is it surprising that Ammianus Marcellinus found the Parthians of interest after Emperor Julian's failed invasion of Mesopotamia in 363 CE. Unfortunately, the destruction of the Parthian Empire by the Sassanid Persians in the middle 220 CE meant that later Roman writers devoted less attention to Parthian history. And as the European and Middle Eastern worlds drifted apart once more by the end of late antiquity, no Greek or Roman history of the Parthians survived the Middle Ages remotely intact. What remained is often a limited and random collection of references to Parthian society and history based upon various known and unknown lost works of antiquity, which provides a broken and often cursory account of the Parthians through the eyes of their rivals. The most important and well-rounded of the surviving accounts of early Parthian history is Justin's 3rd century CE epitome of Pompeius Trogus's history, known as the Historiae Philippicae, which was a universal history of the Eastern world from the ancient Assyrians to the Parthians up to the reign of Emperor Augustus, made into 44 books, and which was written during Augustus's reign. Nothing of Trogus's original Augustan age work survives. However, he appears to have integrated several Greek authors, such as Apollodorus, Timagenes, Ephors, Timaeus, Durus, Posidonius, and Polybius, into his narrative, while maintaining his own conclusions on the subject matter. Scholars continue to debate the extent to which Justin, the one who later came to epitomize this work, they argue how much Justin retained the original language and ideas of Trogus in his epitome. However, most scholars now accept that Justin used Trogus's original work extensively as a framework, but reworked it to his own moralistic ends. In particular, Justin was not interested in Trogus' philosophy or his historical approach, abbreviating or omitting what he did not find fit his own rhetorical objectives, and ignoring historical accuracy and chronology whenever it suited him. Although scholars can identify two voices within the epitome, it is difficult to determine with certainty all of the occasions where Justin inserted his own opinions into the narrative. And to my knowledge, no modern commentary addresses this issue in detail for books 41 and 42, which are specifically focused on the Parthians. This means Parthian scholars must cite Justin extensively, but acknowledge that the sentiments of Justin towards the Parthians also perhaps reflect those of Trogus and his Augustan age peers. Justin's emphasis on Eastern developments and peoples makes his work unique and invaluable within the surviving Greco-Roman tradition. Although Justin only provides us with an outline, Trogus originally recorded the foundation and rise of the Parthian state to dominance over the Hellenistic Middle East in detail because he viewed Rome and Parthia as the successors of the old world order, and because he wanted to portray the Romans, although not completely dominant, as superior in the New World Order, that is, the New World split between Rome and Parthia. Justin's epitome of Trogus is more detailed and far more engaging than Floris's epitome of Livy, making it a vital source of information for the geopolitical developments and cultural developments of the Parthian state, despite its condensed narrative. A contemporary of Trogus, the historian and geographer Strabo, whose more extensive accounts of Parthian history regrettably are now lost, offers information on the background of the Parthians and on their later struggle with Armenia that is an important supplement to Justin's epitome and our other literary sources. Both Trogus and Strabo utilize the Parthian history of Apollodorus, who was a Greek subject of the Parthians in the early 1st century BCE, as an important source. However, Strabo in particular incorporated Apollodorus's conclusions in his sections on Parthian culture, ethnography, and militarism. Trogus and Strabo also appear to have shared Apollodorus's opinions that the Parthians and Romans had split the inhabited world between their rival hegemonies. The other three main literary sources of information on the Parthians are Plutarch, who wrote in the circa early 2nd century CE, Appian, circa middle 2nd century CE, and Cassius Dio, circa early 3rd century CE. Plutarch offers some of the most detailed accounts of certain Parthian events during the Mithridatic Wars and Crassus's invasion of Mesopotamia in his biographies of the Roman generals Lucullus, Pompey, and Crassus. For instance, his detailed account of Crassus's defeat at the hands of the Parthians at the Battle of Carrhae in 53 BCE is unrivaled. However, Plutarch only was interested in the Parthians as they related to his Roman subjects, and therefore he rarely addressed early Parthian history specifically. Appian's history of Rome's wars against the Parthians unfortunately has not survived. And this means that his surviving histories, the Syrian Wars and the Mithridatic Wars, only mention the Parthians in passing. Solus, who wrote in the mid-1st century BCE in his histories, and Memnon of Heraclea, who wrote in the 1st or the 2nd century CE, similarly offer only a few passing references to the Parthians in their accounts of the Mithridatic Wars. Although Appian's surviving accounts rarely offer any detail on Parthian events, he generally is straightforward, matter-of-fact in his writing style, making his accounts usually more reliable than the more rhetorical accounts of Plutarch. And his focus on Eastern kings allowed him to discuss how the Arsacids became major players in the Hellenistic Middle East. Now, Cassius Dio wrote a monumental work known as Roman History. And this Roman history was contained within 80 books, which covered the entire history of Rome from Aeneas, the legendary founder of the Roman people, to the Severan dynasty in roughly the early 3rd century CE. Dio also considered the Parthians worthy rivals of the Romans, and he offers valuable and relatively detailed accounts of Parthian events in his books on the Mithridatic Wars and Crassus's invasion, namely books 30 through 37 and book 40, often with more reliable historical focus than does Plutarch. However, again, the Parthians were only important to Dio as they related to the concerns of Rome, making his work of limited value in reconstructing early aspects of Parthian history. There are other minor sources worth briefly considering as well. Pliny the Elder wrote in the 70s CE, and like Strabo, inserted snippets of Parthian history and culture into his natural history, when he found the Parthians of interest or relevant. Tacitus, writing in the early 2nd century CE, offers important insights in the Romano-Parthian conflict during the reign of Emperor Nero that includes portions of Parthian history. Arrian wrote a Parthian history known as the Parthica in the middle 2nd century CE. However, only fragments of this work survive in much later Byzantine collections. Although Arrian idealized the Parthians and described them as justified in their rebellion against the Seleucids, he followed well-established Greco-Roman literary traditions in portraying the Parthians as nomadic in their origin and unique in their militarism. Ammianus Marcellinus viewed the Roman rivalry with Sassanid Persians under the Emperor Julian the Apostate, or the last pagan emperor of Rome in the 360 CE, as a continuation of the long-held Romano-Parthian conflict, and therefore the origin and militarism of the Parthians still interested him, even though the Parthian state had been gone for over a century. Finally, Josephus, writing in the 1st century CE, offers a very unique Jewish perspective of the rapidly changing geopolitical situation in the Near East in his works, Antiquities of the Jews and also the Jewish Wars. Again, Josephus' references to the Parthians are scattered and often hostile. However, his sources include writers, presumably including Jewish ones, who had a different and more intimate knowledge of developments in the Hellenistic Middle East and of Parthian rule, since a large Jewish community remained in Mesopotamia, which was ruled by the Parthians. Thus, the source difficulties facing scholars of early Parthian history and Parthian history more generally, and indeed of the Hellenistic world in a broad sense, are considerable. It is vital to utilize all available literary, archaeological, epigraphic, and numismatic evidence to establish the most probable reconstruction of events. However, reasonable speculation grounded in the available evidence is necessary and unavoidable. My research investigates the interactions of the Parthians with the Greeks, with the Persians, and the Central Asians within the larger Hellenistic Middle Eastern world, with a critical eye towards the Greek and Roman perspective of our available sources. Such an analysis helps balance our generally Western perception of these events and challenges considerably our current conceptualization of the international environment within the Hellenistic Middle East in the 3rd to 1st centuries BCE. As the field of Parthian studies continues to grow and more material evidence is brought to light, our understanding and indeed our reconstruction of Parthian society and history will continue to evolve. Scholars have portrayed the Parthians as Scythian nomads, as Persian revivalists, and as Hellenistic successors. The Parthian society was an amalgamation of nomadic Persian and Greek elements. Under the leadership of the early Arsacid kings, the flexible cultural identity of the Parthians facilitated their incorporation of influential Irano-Hellenistic customs into their new and expanded society, while in many ways remaining and maintaining the roots of their nomadic existence and past. For instance, their horse-based culture and military. And that's what I want to focus on here for the next few minutes, is the sort of unique militarism of the Parthians. The innovations of the Parthian army are indeed exceptional in the Hellenistic Middle East. Although the Parthians settled on the Iranian plateau in the 230s BCE and came to embrace many cultural influences from Greek and Persian neighbors, they did not adopt the military traditions of the Greeks and the Persians. Instead, the Parthians continued to emphasize the asymmetric cavalry tactics and organization of their nomadic roots. The Parthians recruited their cavalry largely from settled soldiers, who offered service in exchange for land. However, the Parthians' cavalry-focused militarism was of steppe origin, and the social structure of the Parthian state and Parthian society remained closely connected to its military organization. The Parthians were the first major world power to introduce and maintain nomadic cavalry-based hit-and-run tactics and strategies into a successful long-term empire, an achievement the Greco-Roman tradition recognizes. The composition of the Parthian military, its use in the field, and its ability to maintain a major imperial state gave the Parthians perhaps their greatest advantage in their struggle to dominate the Hellenistic Middle East. And the Parthians' asymmetric mode of warfare meant that smaller, more logistically limited, and lighter-armed Parthian armies could resist and annihilate the more professionalized and heavier-armed armies of the Seleucids and Romans through speed, maneuverability, flexibility, and deception. By at least the middle 230s BCE, the Parthians under King Arsaces I had developed a mode of warfare that incorporated their distinctive cavalry-based army and tactics into a wider strategic thinking. Although the Parthians came to include infantry forces in the maintenance of their empire, for over 400 years, the horse remained the focus of Parthian militarism. There never was a serious attempt by the Arsacids to overhaul their cavalry-based army to reform it to more Persian, Greek, or Roman standards. The Parthians emphasized an asymmetric approach to warfare, which was at the core of their tactical and strategic thinking, in part because of their unique military and tactical developments, both on the Central Asian steppe and within the larger Iranian plateau. Often outnumbered by better equipped and stronger Macedonian and Roman enemies, the Parthians developed a calculated military withdrawal strategy that allowed them throughout their history to deceive and outmaneuver more conventional Hellenistic and Roman armies. Similar to other aspects of Parthian history, surviving accounts of the Parthian army on campaign are scattered and often cursory. Plutarch's account of the clash between the Parthians and Romans at the Battle of Carrhae in 53 BCE is our most detailed description of Parthian warfare, making it an invaluable piece of evidence. However, instead of viewing the Carrhae campaign and indeed the battle itself as a near flawless execution of a well-developed Parthian mode of warfare, scholarly tradition generally has attempted to portray the Parthians' tactics and strategy during this campaign as somehow anomalous, and therefore has attempted instead to portray the Parthian general at this battle, a man named Serena, as an unrivaled Parthian military genius and reformer. My research argues instead that the Parthians' military actions during the very famous Carrhae campaign were merely a variation and a continuation of a long-standing unique mode of warfare. Now, the Parthian army primarily remained a cavalry force under the Arsacids for centuries, in part because of heavy influences from the Parthians' nomadic roots. Justin recognized the flexibility of the Parthian army in its incorporation and alteration of nomadic warfare. Meanwhile, both Justin and Josephus recognized that the horse was fundamental to the identity of Parthians within their society and their larger military ethos. Parthian nobles illustrated their status through the quality and the quantity of their horse stable and their retainers. Justin also provides a glimpse into how the Parthians trained for war from a very young age and prepared for campaigns. Although it is noteworthy that our sources exaggerate the Parthians' use of slaves as soldiers, utilizing Roman stereotypes of servile Easterners to explain the composition of the Parthian military, yet Justin's history highlights the importance of riding and archery to Parthian military training. He demonstrates that in times of war, the Parthian king called upon his nobles to provide the horsemen he needed for a campaign. Justin also describes the style of Parthian warfare. He records, quote, of engaging the enemy in close fight and of taking cities by siege. Today, the Parthians know nothing. They fight on horseback, either galloping forward or turning their backs. Often, too, they counterfeit flight, that they may throw their pursuers off their guard, against being wounded by their arrows, unquote. Here, Justin underscores what I like to call the Parthians' feigned retreat and defeat in detail mode of warfare. After the Parthians had established a secure state in what is today northeastern Iran under Arsaces I in the early 230s BCE, and after they had begun expanding that state at the expense of their neighbors, the Parthian army came to possess a marked advantage in mobility and flexibility over more traditionally armed and organized Hellenistic armies. Justin continues, quote, in general, they, the Parthians, retire before the enemy in the very heat of the engagement, and soon after their retreat, return to the battle afresh, so that when you feel most certain that you have conquered them, you have still to meet the greatest danger from them, unquote. Justin illustrates that the Parthians utilize aggressive hit and run and deceptive feign retreat maneuvers as the core of their innovative mode of warfare throughout the Hellenistic Middle East. When implemented correctly, the Parthians' unique mode of asymmetric warfare was devastating, giving them an important military advantage that aided in their survival and eventual rise to power. The Parthians became famous for a military maneuver commonly known as the Parthian shot. King Arsaces I and his followers, before establishing themselves in Parthia in the 230s BCE, were one of several groups on the Central Asian steppe developing this asymmetric approach to combat. However, the Parthians were responsible for introducing it to the wider Greco-Roman world, that is in the Middle East and the Near East, and also for perfecting its use in battle. Parthian horse archers developed a highly effective system of delivering fire upon an enemy as they advanced and withdrew. The Parthian shot was the process by which a rider gripped and maneuvered his horse away from the enemy with his lower body, while turning his upper body back toward the enemy to deliver precise fire. It was one of the most effective military techniques developed in the ancient world. Added to this effectiveness, at least according to our Greek and Roman sources, was the unique structure and devastating power of the Parthian composite bow, giving the Parthians a technological advantage as well. The Parthians adapted and developed a complex production process, allowing large-scale manufacturing of the renowned Parthian composite bow, while importing and casting high-quality steel for their arms and armor. With these advantages, the Parthians successfully developed the Parthian shot technique into a highly synchronized and potentially devastating battlefield tactical maneuver that they could deliver aggressively or defensively to great effect. Yet the use of lightly armed horse archers on their own in battle was not a reliable way for the Parthians to secure victory, especially against the heavily armored and numerically superior armies of the Seleucids and Romans. Since the arms and armor, or lack thereof, of horse archers were inadequate for close combat, this posed serious tactical and strategic problems for nomadic horse archer-based armies in ancient warfare. We know from various images of Parthian archers in sculpture and coinage that they rode to battle in little to no armor, as seen in the pictured relief on your screen. Thus, horse archers were relatively useless in hand-to-hand combat on the battlefield, as Justin emphasized. If an enemy could manage to engage the Parthian horse archers, the result was usually disastrous for the Parthians. For instance, Justin relates a story where Seleucid soldiers destroyed an army of Parthian cavalry in Malea. Meanwhile, Tacitus recounts a much later battle where an enemy army forced the Parthian horse archers to fight in close range and destroyed them. Moreover, the bow itself is a problematic weapon. First, because it requires good weather to fire correctly, limiting its effectiveness in winter especially. And second, because it relies on supplies of ammunition for its effectiveness. In fact, Dio records that the Parthians avoided warfare in, quote, the dead of winter, unquote, because it was simply too wet. He also notes that the Parthians at the Battle of Carrhae in 53 BCE finally had to retire from battle because, quote, their bow strings snapped under the constant shooting and the missiles were exhausted, unquote. In theory, well-equipped and organized armies could hope to simply wait out a force of enemy horse archers until the riders had exhausted their limited supply of arrows and had to withdraw. These glaring combat deficiencies generally restricted the effectiveness and sustainability of nomadic forces in battle and on campaign. If the Parthians hoped to develop into a more effective military force that could contend with the superior size, equipment, and organization of the Hellenistic and later Roman armies in the Near East and Middle East, then they had to develop logistical and military innovations to make their armies more competitive. So first, the Parthians addressed the supply restrictions facing their horse archers. For example, at the Battle of Carrhae, Plutarch tells us that Crassus, the Roman general, had hoped to outlast the barrage of the Parthian horse archers until they had exhausted their supply of arrows. However, the Parthians resupplied their bowmen with, quote, many camels laden with arrows, unquote. Scholars generally assume without good reason that this extra supply of arrows delivered to the Parthian horse archers at the Battle of Carrhae was a unique and singular innovation of the Parthian commander Serena. However, such a scenario is highly unlikely, and no ancient writer makes this claim. Plutarch's emphasis in this passage is not that the sudden logistical innovation of Serena confounded the Romans. Rather, his moralistic rhetorical emphasis is to portray Crassus as an ill-prepared and woefully outmaneuvered foil to the wiser and more capable subordinate, Cassius. By the middle 50s BCE, the Roman army recently had gained experience fighting against nomadic mercenaries hired by Mithridates VI of Pontus and Tigranes II of Armenia. However, the Pontic and Armenian armies, which were more traditionally organized and equipped, had recruited and utilized horse archers sparingly. The Parthian army was quite different from these contemporary Near Eastern powers because it utilized horse archers as a fundamental portion of its military force and as a crucial factor in its tactics. Yet Crassus and his contemporaries, who had never fought a major battle against the Parthians before, made no clear distinction between the military forces of the Parthians and those of other Irano-Hellenized peoples in the Near East, in large part because of ignorance and prevalent Roman stereotypes about Eastern peoples. Therefore, at Carrhae, the heavy contingent of horse archers and the logistical capabilities of the Parthians surprised Crassus, not because they were some sudden innovation of a unique Parthian military genius, but rather because the Romans were unfamiliar with the different composition and capabilities of the Parthian army because they assumed the Parthians simply fought like all other Eastern peoples. Again, instead of viewing the Parthian army at Carrhae atypically, we should instead consider that the Parthian general Surena merely executed a variation of the Parthians' traditional mode of warfare. It is highly unlikely that the Parthians, who won several decisive victories and experienced unparalleled military success against their rivals within the Hellenistic Middle East, had not developed a logistical solution as simple as bringing more arrows to the battlefield through a baggage train in order to resupply their horse archers prior to the battle at Carrhae. The size of Surena's baggage train at this battle was perhaps unusual because of his exceptional affluence and power. However, the concept of resupplying horse archers on the battlefield should hardly be considered unique to him, especially since even Plutarch does not make this claim. Meanwhile, although Plutarch is the only ancient writer who mentions supplies of arrows on the battlefield explicitly, it is illogical to argue, as some scholars do, that Surena implemented a sudden logistical innovation at Carrhae, which was crucial to the success of the Parthian army against the Romans, that the Parthians then, after Carrhae, abruptly abandoned without thought. We should not consider the Parthian baggage train at Carrhae an isolated innovation simply because only Plutarch, with his unusually detailed account, makes a specific record of it. We must consider the likely possibility instead that the Parthians in fact already had developed a mobile method of resupplying their horse archers on the battlefield during their rise to supremacy within the Hellenistic Middle East, which Surena later adapted and which the Parthians of course continued to use long after Carrhae. In addition, to make their army more competitive and threatening, the Parthians developed heavily armored cavalrymen, commonly known as cataphracts, to supplement their force of horse archers and to enhance the offensive capabilities of their army considerably. The Parthian cataphracts paired the armored cavalry of the Central Asian tribes with the Macedonian-style long lance. And because of the Parthians, this new form of shock cavalry became increasingly popular in the West, eventually being adopted, in fact, by the Romans. Over the course of the 3rd to 1st centuries BCE, the Parthian military maintained and expanded its access to sources of high-quality mounts, acquiring, breeding, and training Central Asian and Iranian horses. As the Parthians expanded further into the Iranian plateau, they came increasingly to favor Iranian horses, which were known for their outstanding speed, strength, and beauty, while importing superior steel from Central Asia to arm and armor their cavalry. The Parthians' access to abundant supplies of high-quality mounts and superior steel afforded them another advantage on the battlefield over their Greek and Roman rivals. The Parthians used their heavy cavalry in battle to protect their horse archers and to exploit weak points in enemy formations. This method of warfare was so successful that the Parthian military barely changed for 4 centuries. For example, Dio, writing in the early 3rd century CE, around the time of the fall of the Parthian Empire, succinctly illustrates the makeup and fighting style of the Parthians in similar terms to those of Plutarch, who was writing a century before him, to that of Pompeius Trogus, who was writing during the Augustan age, and indeed to that even of Polybius, who was writing in the 2nd century BCE. Another important clue is found in Dio's 40th book. Dio briefly describes the origin of the Parthians and emphasizes the Parthians' asymmetric hit-and-run tactics, while recording that the Parthians maintained a large reserve of fresh horses while on campaign to utilize in battle. Although he does not mention supplies of arrows explicitly, he clearly demonstrates that the Parthians understood the importance of resupplying their soldiers on the battlefield. The reserve of fresh horses mentioned by Dio further illustrates that the Parthian army developed a mobile supply train for battle that was not, in fact, unique to Carrhae. The Parthians used these fresh mounts to harass the enemy formations with quick strikes and withdrawals. It is difficult to deny that these fresh mounts also would have carried supplies of arrows for their new assaults and feigned retreats, particularly of the Parthian horse archers. Dios soon after claims that the Parthians, who were, quote, almost invincible, unquote, when defending their territory, struggled with, quote, offensive war because they encountered an entirely different condition of land and sky, and because they do not lay in supplies of food or pay, unquote. Numerous successes in their conquests from their earlier history, Dio's criticism here of the logistical limitations of the Parthians emphasizes feeding and paying their soldiers during a prolonged campaign. He does not claim that the Parthians struggled to supply ammunition to their soldiers. Rather, he recognizes that the Parthians' ability to re-equip their soldiers on the battlefield, especially when the terrain was favorable, was exemplary. Without the development of a system of supply for fresh mounts and arrows to their soldiers, the Parthians could not have sustained major campaigns or endured extended battles offensively or defensively against the Seleucids and Romans on several occasions over the course of multiple centuries. Additionally, it seemed highly likely that this logistical innovation occurred under the early Arsacids. For example, Polybius, writing again in the 2nd century BCE, records that the Parthian army under King Arsaces II assaulted the vastly superior army of the Seleucid king Antiochus III in 209 BCE near a place known as Mount Labus in northern Iran with great determination for an entire day. The duration and vigor of the Parthians' assaults would not have been possible without a way to resupply their horse archers. Thus, the establishment of a strong military identity and infrastructure under the early Arsacids and the implementation of a logistical system to resupply their horse archers, paired with the development of perhaps the most devastating and versatile heavy cavalry in the world in this period, made the Parthian military more sustainable on campaign and in battle than any of its nomadic contemporaries. The Parthians emerged as the major rival of the more professionally organized Seleucids and Romans, in large part because of their unique military and unique approach to warfare. It was this pairing of speed and strength within the Parthian army that allowed the Parthians to develop their unique feign retreat, defeat in detail mode of warfare. All right, so for those of you sick of military explanations for Parthian success, let's go ahead and look at some structural aspects as far as rule and society are concerned. Although elements of their steppe origin clearly were important to the development of Parthian society and warfare, the early Arsacid kings quickly recognized the usefulness of adopting aspects of Irano-Hellenistic tradition to support their rule, especially in the development of their coinage, art, and literature, and language, sorry. The Parthians successfully melded aspects of nomadic Persian and Greek tradition into their multicultural, multilinguistic, and multi-religious society to create a uniquely diverse identity within the Hellenistic Middle East that gave the Parthians important advantages in their competition with neighboring states. Parthians utilized their social versatility to establish and expand their imperialism, absorbing diverse and disparate communities into a lasting empire through the consolidation of power under the guidance of the early Arsacid kings and their flexible imperial ideology. Throughout much of the 3rd to 1st centuries BCE, the Parthians came to represent interests in these multicultural communities throughout the Hellenistic Middle East better than their Greek rivals. The cultural flexibility of the Parthians helped encourage indigenous communities to support the early Arsacid kings, which in turn allowed the Parthians to occupy large sections of the Middle East quickly under capable and charismatic leadership. The more dismissive and exploitative occupation of these multicultural eastern territories by the Seleucids created local resentment on a scale that the Parthians rarely encountered. Thus, compared to the Seleucid occupation of the Middle East, indigenous aristocrats and communities had heightened regional autonomy and power under the Parthians, with greater access to authority and participation within the Parthian imperial system. A major factor in the ability of the Parthians to establish, maintain, and expand their hegemony throughout the Hellenistic Middle East was the inclusiveness of their society, which the early Arsacid kings utilized to embrace regional aristocracies and incorporate them into a more flexible structure of empire. The Parthian state from its conception built upon the social flexibility of a multicultural union of regional leaders under the ultimate authority of the early Arsacid kings. This made the high command of the Parthian state versatile and eclectic, allowing the Parthians to develop a more inclusive system of administration that emphasized, utilized, and internalized the capabilities and strengths of local leaders. The Parthians eventually divided their empire into 18 districts and appointed vassal kings or governors to maintain and manage these regions. However, partly because of the limitations of their military capabilities and partly for reasons of expediency, the Parthians created a more extensive vassalage system to support their imperialism, which generally allowed greater local autonomy and political representation in subject regions in exchange for royal support. Moreover, since the Parthians' professional standing army was relatively small, the Arsacids increasingly utilized their network of strong aristocratic families and vassal kingdoms to raise necessary levies and share the military burden of controlling such a large imperial territory. This meant that first, as their empire expanded, the Parthians could conduct quick, successful campaigns with their limited military and yet maintain their territorial gains without the need for costly, drawn-out occupation. And second, during their intense rivalries with the Seleucids and the Romans, the Parthians could vigorously defend their territory against invaders with a loyal and determined army. By establishing tributary kingdoms in the peripheral regions of the Parthian Empire, the Parthians also delegated many of the responsibilities and costs of maintaining these regions to their vassals, while preserving a flexible approach to encouraging the loyalty and participation of vassal rulers by utilizing threats of invasion, occupation, and replacement. Thus, the Parthians created a nuanced imperial system that afforded them many of the benefits of direct empire, such as military resources and tax revenue, while avoiding the difficult tasks of provincial administration, management of major urban centers, and frontier defense. This allowed the Parthians to maintain a consistent strategy for Western expansion, especially in the late 2nd and early centuries BCE. Through a network of through a system of their own governance, but also a network of tributary kingdoms and marriage alliances. This nuanced approach to imperialism, paired with the innovations of the Parthian military, significantly aided the standing and the longevity of the capable early Arsacid kings politically and militarily, and allowed the Parthians to establish one of the greatest Middle Eastern empires in world history. Thank you all for your time and attention.
Right. Thanks very much, Nick, for that engaging lecture and a good example for all of our current classical studies and Latin students of what we expect them to be doing in 10 years' time. I think one of the great contributions of this research is the way that it fits in to the rethinking of a number of kingdoms, especially in recent research, the Seleucids and the Bactriads. I guess this sort of started in the 1980s after Orientalism, and we all know as classicists now that we have to do two things. We have to understand what local people thought, and also that we have to have good social scientific methodology. So I think your research combines both of those things. But one of the things you mentioned as an advantage of IR theory was the ability to relate the Parthians to the Bactrian Seleucids and so on. And I wonder how recent research on the Seleucids and Bactrians, how has that shaped your understanding of the Parthians? And in particular, if we go to a more specific historical question, how do you think that the conflicts, a series of conflicts between the Bactrians and the Parthians, and then especially the eventual dissolution of the Bactrians, affected Parthian, its ability to sort of swing its weight in the later period?
Yeah, great questions. So in general, what's been great about this particular field of research is as in a prior talk that I gave, Rahim Shaigan, who's a great scholar of the ancient Middle East, mentioned that now what we're living in many ways is a renaissance of Middle Eastern studies, in particular Parthian studies being an important facet of that. And so the work that I'm doing with Parthia is being done by brilliant scholars in Bactrian studies and Seleucid studies as well, really trying to understand what's going on in the Middle Eastern context from as much as we can a Middle Eastern perspective. And so my research, I hope, has been in line with the sort of sense of that new developments within scholarship historiography, the idea that so much of our understanding of the Near East and Middle East has been dominated by a Western perspective because our sources are Western, right? They're Greek and Roman. And what this sort of new wave of research is trying to do is obviously take Greco-Roman source material on its own terms, but also whenever possible, try to consider the Eastern perspective of what's happening in these events and why these Western audiences are interested in these materials, what their motivation is, so on and so forth. All the good things that historians are supposed to be doing when they're sort of deconstructing their source materials. More specifically, as far as interactions within the Iranian plateau between Bactria and the Seleucids, Parthia develops in a very dangerous, very violent neighborhood. And much like the Goodfellas or a gangster movie, right? If you grow up in a difficult, dangerous neighborhood, you tend to be difficult and dangerous yourself. And that's kind of the root of what IR theory is trying to demonstrate as a theoretical framework, is that without the modern systems in place, without the modern forms of embassy, United Nations, ability to pick up a phone and talk to somebody, with this sort of void of connectivity as far as geopolitics is concerned, that the ancient world in many ways is one of the most anarchic forms of an international environment, where really it's all about self-help. It's all about taking on your own responsibilities and making a way in life for yourself. You can't rely on anybody else. The Parthians are a reflection of this. They have a very difficult time establishing themselves in northern Iran, and they have a very difficult time protecting and expanding their territory in these regions, because the Bactrians are heavily militarized themselves. The Seleucids certainly are. There's several major Eastern campaigns conducted by Seleucid kings to mimic Alexander the Great and conquer the great Eastern territories. The greatest of which was Antiochus III, as I kind of mentioned briefly. But the Parthians are constantly dealing with this sort of threat of destruction that helps focus them in many ways on excelling in their militarism, and also the structure of their society, which again segues well, I think, into their concepts of being very adaptable socially, very adaptable administratively, politically, ideologically. On this slide that I have on everyone's screen, the reason why I pulled this one particular coin as an example. So this is Arsaces the 13th. His name is Gotarzes the First, but all Parthian kings took the name Arsaces as sort of an homage or to honor the original founder of the Parthian state, and Arsaces the First. So this is the 13th king of the Parthians, Gotarzes the First. He is the son of Mithridates II, one of the greatest and most accomplished of the Parthian kings, and he ruled roughly from 91 to 87 BCE. But why I think this coin is really quite fascinating is that it's modeled in a Greek style, off of Greek imagery in many senses, but really kind of collectively shows you this amalgamation of Persian, Greek, and nomadic elements within the wider constructs of what is the Parthian world. So you have here, for example, the king on one side and a seated archer on the other. The archer is in traditional nomadic garb, holding a bow and arrow, reflecting the nomadic importance of the origin and the roots of the Parthians. The king himself, as you can see here, has sort of Greek and Persian elements of imperial propaganda and ideology. So he has what we can see is sort of a diadem or sort of that ribbon of power and rule that he has there, but also an Eastern style crown. The coin itself is, in its Greek inscription, says the coin of the king of kings, Arsaces, just, beneficent, and admirer of the Greeks. And here I have the Greek inscription below it. There again, you see the imagery of the archer, right? The nomadic origin of who the Parthians are. The titulature of the king of kings, which is what the Achaemenid Persians claim to be, right? The ultimate authority in the world. And also this idea of being admirers of the Greeks and indeed constructing or crafting their coinage in a very familiar Greek style. And I think that, again, coins like this kind of really, in a visual way, represent what I was trying to drive at. That the Parthians are not one thing or the other. They are a patchwork, and a very precise and calculated patchwork of all of these various aspects.
Yeah, so as a Macedonian archaeologist and historian, it sort of warmed my heart to hear about these cavalry sallies and the kind of things we hear about Macedonia in the classical period, confronting more advanced armies, and then also I think we see from your lecture that the Parthians are adapting many of the strategies we associate with other groups, adopting this Greek local hybrid identity to advance their own prerogatives. Right, I think we have a few questions already in the Q&A. I invite anyone who wants to write a question, but also to just type in the Q&A, I have a question, and then I will enable your microphone. So Guy Chet says, as little as we know about the Parthians in Mesopotamia, do we know even less about their administration and their wars in the eastern parts of their empire? Did the armies they faced in the east, i.e. in Central Asia, look and operate like their own?
Yeah, thank you for that question. Yeah, it's a great question as well, because of course, with an imperial space as big as the Parthian Empire becomes, it's not surprising that the Western theater and the Eastern theater sometimes are different theaters and different sort of regions that get consideration. Now, as far as our ancient Greek and Roman sources are concerned, they do emphasize that one of the things that the Parthians readily adopt from the Persian tradition, unlike the Macedonian tradition, is a floating capital. Mm-hmm. The Seleucids establish a capital in Mesopotamia originally, the city of Seleucia on the Tigris, which is kind of seen as a rival to Babylon within the region. But within the first generation, that capital moves to Antioch on the Orontes, which is in what would be modern-day Western Syria. And so the shift of the imperial focus of the Seleucid Empire directly goes to the Eastern Mediterranean world and the wider conflicts with the other Diadochi, the other successors of Alexander the Great. The Parthians, much like the Achaemenid Persians, prefer this kind of idea of a floating imperial capital, where essentially different seasons the court is in different regions of the empire. And so there's a bit of a split between Western and Eastern considerations and focus during each annual cycle. I think this allows the Parthians to be more responsive. It allows them to be more in touch with local concerns and ideas. It also allows them to be more flexible in the sense that they're not simply focused on one direction primarily, and really the second, right? Not a Western perspective primarily, and then the Eastern one is a distant second, like you find with the Seleucids. But certainly the Parthians, one of the big growing pains that you find in early Parthian history is that when they go from a small state in the northeastern corner of Iran to a major imperial power, they have some difficulty wrapping their head around how difficult it is controlling all of that territory and managing all of those vulnerable and sometimes violent frontiers. I think that's really the motivation for why we start seeing them shifting towards a more vassal-centric approach to imperialism when we start getting into sort of the late second and early first centuries BCE. I think that they recognize how difficult their establishment of power and authority over the eastern frontier was, and in order to sort of mitigate that a bit in the West, they prefer this sort of approach towards vassal kings that they can rely on to help sort of shoulder the burden and the responsibility of imperial maintenance.
Great. And Arvin Magsudlu, I hope I've got that name right, asks, how do you define the Parthians' Irano-Hellenistic identity? Are Parthians Iranian or are they distinct? Does this identity and image remain consistent over time and until the end of the period?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And really there you're kind of getting into what is identity for ancient peoples. The modern states of Iran and Turkmenistan, they do favor kind of claiming Parthia as kind of their cultural heritage. And so in a modern sense, you do see kind of I suppose you could say similar to what we see in the modern nation states of Greece and Macedonia, right? This sort of idea of who has legitimate claim to the identity of the ancient past. So that certainly is still relevant in modern circles. But if we're looking at it in an ancient context, what are the Parthians? Well, they're really kind of they're a collection. That the origin of the Parthians is different from the origin of who becomes the Parthians. And I know that sounds really kind of meta and strange, but what I mean by that is that originally the people who become the Parthians as we know them originate as a Central Asian tribe known as the Parni. And they have a separate identity that is Central Asian and not of the Iranian plateau. They eventually migrate into the Iranian plateau. They settle in northern Iran, what would be northern Iran today, and they integrate themselves culturally, socially, politically, militarily into an already established indigenous population within Parthia. So you even see this in the source materials, where Greek and Roman writers get confused, where they refer to the Parthians, where they mean to say the Parthians before the Parthians came to be, but they make a connection and sort of just mash all of it together. And so even the Greeks and the Romans were kind of confused how this really worked. So the Parthians on the ground, my sort of inclination is that they were much like many migratory groups. They were very open and culturally flexible. They were very curious about what was already established and working within the regions in which they were now inhabiting. And the Parthians, to their credit, were very clever in being able to kind of pick and choose the elements of Persian and Hellenistic culture that were already well established within the Hellenistic Middle East at this period, and then adopt it, internalize it, and adapt it to work for them and really allow them to maximize their potential.
Yeah, so I labored through much of my graduate career with the Macedonia issue very much alive. And thank God now we have the Republic of North Macedonia. And another example is Albania, where I also worked. And the southern part of Albania, from the standpoint of Hellenists, it was part of the ancient kingdom of Epirus, but many Albanian politicos especially are really keen for us to say that everything discovered in Albania is Illyrian.
Yeah,
right? So
sure.
this is another attempt by a modern nation state to sort of master the past.
Yeah.
But in any case, James Ross asks, what factors led to the decline of the Parthian Empire?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, and it is much debated among scholars as what were the reasons for the eventual decline and fall of the Parthians. There are really three camps. One is the Romans beat them up enough that they eventually declined and fell. One is that the Sassanid Persians were superior and through their rebellion overthrew a sort of decrepit sick man of the Middle East in the form of the Parthians. And the one that is gaining momentum and the one that I would adhere to is that the Parthians were very much still powerful up to almost the last decade of their existence. We have, in fact, plenty of evidence that the Roman emperor Caracalla, who had an abortive campaign against the Parthians, who really made the Parthians angry through his duplicitousness and his violence, that once they got rid of him, right, once the Romans, killed him because he certainly deserved it, his replacement, Macrinus, eagerly gets out of the war against the Parthians because he's very fearful of the potential retribution that he faces in a major Eastern war against the Parthians. And that, again, the historians like Herodian mentioned that the Parthian army was large, that they had great resources, that the Parthian king was a force to be reckoned with. So we know that even in the 220s, right, when the Parthian Empire essentially collapses in 224 with the rise of Sassanid Persians. And there's a lot of debate as to why suddenly this happens. But I think you could mirror it in the sudden destruction of the Byzantine Empire with the rise of the Islamic Caliphate, the complete overthrow, this destruction of the southern Byzantine Empire, and then the complete overthrow of the Sassanid Persian Empire by the Caliphate in the 7th century. I think there's similarities there. There's similarities with Cyrus the Great's rebellion, the Achaemenid Persian uprising against the Median Empire. The Median Empire is one of the greatest empires in the world, and within a couple of years, it doesn't exist anymore. And so what you have, I think, happening with the Parthian Empire is the same thing that you see in these other examples, where just a handful of mistakes, politically, militarily, lead to a precipitous decline in the confidence of other territories in the centralized governance and authority of the Arsacids themselves. And once the Arsacids aren't in control of their larger network of important families and vassals, they have very limited ability to carry on conflicts on their own. So once you kind of break that confidence and you have a momentous rebellion, it's not necessarily, I think, surprising that you have this transition of power between the Arsacids and the Sassanids in the middle 220s. And Christopher, did you have something you wanted to add to that?
Yeah, well, first of all, I wanted to say, thank you for such a great talk. I've been looking forward to this a long time, and, I was not disappointed. So thank you. And I just had two questions. They're kind of one's a little, and one's maybe a bigger one. One is, what have your interactions with Iranian scholars been like? I'm just curious what, kind of historiography of this is among Iranians. And also kind of like what, in terms of kind of working on Parthia, what do you think needs to be done next? What's a good next step, either by something you yourself want to do or the thing that you kind of wish someone else would do in Parthian history?
Yeah. Two great questions. So my experience within the wider Parthian studies is generally dominated by French scholars, Polish scholars, Russian scholars, and then to a lesser extent, Iranian scholars and English scholars as well, kind of to a lesser extent. And my interaction generally has been quite receptive. It's been a really welcoming atmosphere. I think that because of the relative neglect of the Parthians, that there's plenty of room at the table. There's not sort of this old guard that's trying to keep everybody else out of it, that kind of thing. The more the merrier seems to be my sentiment anyway, in my experience. Iranian scholars tend to focus on the Achaemenids and the Sassanids. That's their bread and butter. That's modern nation state of Iran takes great pride in the accomplishments of the Achaemenid Persians and the Sassanid Persians. It's a newer development that they're starting to take pride in the Parthians. And so Iranian scholars generally are before and after the Parthian world. And so with my recent research, what I've mostly had is them reaching out to me saying, this is really a wonderful development as far as trying to bridge the gap that has formed in Middle Eastern studies between what came in the classical period, what came in late antiquity. And so again, I can't say really any more than just it's been quite a great experience and very warm and welcoming. In general, remind me of your second question, Christopher.
What needs to be done next?
Oh, right. What's on the horizon? So when I mentioned that there's kind of a renaissance of Parthian studies, what's pretty amazing is that within really the past few years, but even in 2020 and 21, there have been three major studies. So myself, and then Jason Shluda just wrote a brand new book on Roman-Parthian relationships, starting with Crassus and going all the way through the Severan period. And then Ewell Ellerbrock, who has literally just published a new book on the Parthians within, I think, the past month, called The Forgotten Empire, which I haven't had a chance to read yet, but I'm really excited for it. It looks like it's a more holistic approach that try to sort of create a syncretism of not only just political, military aspects, but also social, religious, cultural aspects as well. So I think that there's plenty of room for those developments. Lee Bryce has reached out to me with a couple of ideas. I think that there's a need for a new study on the historiography and the historiographical developments of Parthian studies. And my particular second project is going to be a reassessment of the first half of the 1st century BCE in the Near East, trying to reinterpret and understand what is happening geopolitically between Pontus, Armenia, Parthia, and Rome, and in particular, trying to reassess those developments as much as possible from an Eastern perspective instead of the traditional Roman-centric perspective.
Great. And a question from Kat Williams. What were the religious aspects of Parthian rule? Do we know any of their religious practices? Did they see their kings as divine?
So we do have a sense of some religious aspects of Parthian society. In general, the Parthians were rather open and off, sort of soft-handed as far as religious policy and understanding were concerned. They did not micromanage communities and tell them what they could and could not worship. In a sense, they kind of follow the Achaemenid model in that sense, right? The idea is that local autonomy as far as religion and governance was mostly respected by the Arsacids, by the Parthians in general. As long as you paid your taxes, you put forward your levies, and you respected the right of the rule of the Arsacid king, you could do pretty much whatever you wanted locally otherwise. We do know that in kind of the traditional capital cities of like Nisa and Asak, which are in what would be eastern Turkmenistan today, sort of southern eastern Turkmenistan, that they apparently had an element of fire worship in their religion, that there was an eternal fire that was to be maintained as a representation of the power and ongoing authority of the Arsacid kings and their right to rule. We know that there are aspects of Zoroastrianism that are very popular. I talked a little bit about the astronomical diaries, and so there's an aspect of astrology that's important there as well. And then also dabbling in traditional polytheistic understandings that we would be more comfortable with in a Greek context as well. So much like their approach to governance, it's very eclectic, the Parthian approach to religion.
Okay, bringing things back to the wider perspective of world history, another question from Guy Chet. And reminder, if you want to type your question in the Q&A or let me know there that you have a question, I'll activate your microphone to ask it live. But Guy asks, is the instability of the empires of this region, Mesopotamia to India, considered unique in the history of empires? Or is there something about this region that made it difficult for the Assyrians, Babylonians, Persians, Parthians, Sassanids, to sustain their rule for long, as did the Egyptians, Chinese, Romans, Byzantines, Muslims?
Yeah, that's a great question, right? It's really world history at its most worldliness, right? I would say that there's two factors that jump right off the sort of page to me initially. Unlike the Greek world, or more in a more focused sense, the Roman world, where you have the Mediterranean facilitating the movement of communication, supplies, money, soldiers, everything you need. You do not have that body of water facilitating these things in a Middle Eastern context. And that makes things so much more difficult when you're talking about the running of large imperial space over a long period of time. This is why the developments of infrastructure under the Achaemenid Persians are really miraculous. Like the Royal Road from Sardis to Susa is an amazing undertaking. And it's a reflection that the Achaemenid Persian Empire recognized that this was a problem and a weakness, this lack of the ability to move goods and services and money and communication from one end of the empire to the other. Another aspect there, I think that's a major recurring factor, as you pointed out in your question, is that Mesopotamia is a pretty tough place to defend. There's nothing naturally that is going to really be to your advantage as far as protecting Mesopotamia, unless you also control Iran. Because if you control Iran, you have the Zagros mountain range to kind of help protect things from an Eastern context. But from a Western context, right, in fact, Mesopotamia works against itself because it has the Euphrates and the Tigris, which encourages and facilitates other outside forces from the West attacking you deep within your territory and rather rapidly. And the Romans do this all the time, using the Euphrates and the Tigris to move their ships, their soldiers, their supplies in these various campaigns. So I think the general vulnerability of Mesopotamia is an issue. The lack of a major a body of water like the Mediterranean is an issue. Also, the eclecticness of the Middle East, and in the sense that I know that the Roman Empire was indeed eclectic, but in the Western world, they really got to put a Roman stamp on a lot of that territory. And in the Eastern world, there was already a Greek stamp on it. In the Middle Eastern world, there are so many ancient civilizations and cultures and religious ideas that are already well established regionally that it's harder to make a more universal imperial stamp on these territories than say the Romans do, or you know, if you're looking at Han China as an example, I think that there's major advantages that those imperial spaces have over the middle, right? It's called the Middle East for a reason, right? There's a lot of advantages to being in the middle, commercially in particular. There's a lot of disadvantages for being in the middle, and I think we see that with major imperial spaces in the Middle East.
Indeed. So if there are no further questions, I think that's a good general point on which to call a halt to the formal discussion. And I know that everyone wants to show their appreciation. I'm sorry, that's one of the drawbacks of the webinar, that we can't all applaud, but those of us who are panelists are doing that, and want to thank you for an excellent talk.
Yes, thank you. I know you're all giving me the Arsenio Hall, you know, dog pound, whoop, whoop, whoop in the background. Yeah, I want to express again, thank you to everybody who shared this time with us and listened to some Parthian history. So thank you again.
So hope to see many of you on Friday, and then for our next lecture on Thursday, the 25th of March. But if you'd like to continue the conversation, we have another 15 minutes, I guess, with Dr. Overtoom. Please join us at unt.zoom.us MYMA Gallagher. And so that's also in the chat if you want to cut and paste it. And otherwise, a very good evening, everyone, and hope to see some of you in a moment.